Well, good morning, everyone. Again, I'm James Garland, and I'm with Federal Highway Administration. And I'm going to jump right in because we're sharing time, and I know better than to go long and stand in between people and lunch. Today's presentation, I'm going to talk about FHWA's interest in the topic, talk about some global and national trends. All of you already know most of that, but we'll just touch on it briefly. Some research we've conducted on the topic of megaregions, a workshop series that we rolled out nationally for about 2 years on the topic, and then some observations, challenges, and next steps. So this map, in thinking about it last night, since I didn't make it to dinner, I'm in the Residence Inn, which is plush. I'm joking. And just kind of reflecting, I talked about my experience as a Fed for the last 17 years, but I thought, well, when was I first exposed to megaregions? And it wasn't 4 years ago. I actually grew up here. This is Lake Charles, Louisiana. It's about, 30 miles before you hit water for the Gulf of Mexico. As a kid, I was obsessed with this place. That's Houston. That's where the sports teams were, the better shopping. We caught the radio stations from there. As a teenager, they had better music. This is a town of about 80,000 people. Houston is a population about a little more than 5 million metro, maybe a little bit more than that. About a 2-hour commute on a good day, 130 miles. And it just occurred to me as a teenager and as an adolescent growing up, the connectivity between the two places were just, I didn't understand why the areas weren't growing closer together. I had a lot of family in between that particular area. For those not familiar with that geography, you do have to make that trip by car. There's no high-speed rail. You can fly, but by the time you go, with the limited schedules, you might as well just make the drive. So, megaregions for me has been around for quite some time. This is a quote about the megacities and how we're merging into these vast megaregions, which most of us already here know. You've seen this map, talking about the 37 megacities that we have currently in 2015. And these are just some depictions of cities that have more than 10 million people, with Tokyo being the largest area. And this is a quote from a good friend and colleague of ours, Catherine Ross. We've worked, we being Federal Highway, directly with Catherine. She's been a very strategic advisor and a friend on the topic of megaregions. We've consulted with her on a host of issues in terms of messaging and thinking and strategic policy direction in terms of how to really take this, as well as consolidating with a lot of the work that you all have done here in the room as well. This is just another quick visual. Megacities are set for growth, and then some of the current and future megacities that we have here. This is a map that we produced in-house that you may not see many places, but what you see that's interesting here is we overlaid some of the megaregional names. We took the 2050 names, and also Catherine had a different take on her map with megaregions. There's also the Nelson and Ray piece that's out there as well. But we actually overlaid this with just existing MPO boundaries, Metropolitan Planning Organization boundaries. And a lot of the boundaries for MPOs abutted each other and lined up very nicely within these megaregions. You can see the Midwest is a nice conglomeration. We'll talk about that in just a minute. And then you can see the Northeast and the Mid-Atlantic. We actually broke those two regions. And I know some people will keep those as one continuous area, but it just depends on style. So all of this led to us looking at some research that we conducted. And instead of getting into a whole bunch of detail about it, I thought it'd just be useful to just show you the names of these titles that we have. If you want to talk or chat about them, I'd be more than happy to do so. Dating back to 2006 and 2008 and leading into today, we've done a lot of work on the topic. We've actually supported USDOT's Volpe Center, which is just down the street here in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Some of you may be familiar with a few folks from that particular entity, but we've worked with them on some earlier publications in terms of the role of transportation planning and multi-jurisdictional coordination. Ming Jun talked about one issue that we've had, which is messaging. We have changed the name so many times because from a political standpoint, folks have assumed when you think about megaregions, they thought, oh, that's an Obama administration thing. You have to talk about it from another perspective. So then we came up with multi-jurisdictional coordination and planning. That's a mouthful. Then we came up with national economic partnerships. That doesn't really resonate with people. and then we're right back to the term megaregions. But I'll talk about that as a challenge because that's been an issue of getting people to understand that we, from a federal perspective, don't own the topic or don't own the name, and that this is going to happen regardless if there's federal involvement or not. And from where I sit, that's a big challenge, but we'll talk about that. One interesting piece that we did do that's really good is that we partnered with the American Planning Association to produce multimodal planning at the megaregional scale that was released in June of 2017. We actually have a second phase of that product that's coming available online soon. And then we also worked, again, we've been working with Catherine Ross for quite some time. These earlier two pieces, they may be a little hard to see, two literature reviews on different facets of megaregions. And then through USDOT Volpe Center and through our Everyday Counts 3 initiative, we produced a regional models of cooperation handbook on just multi-jurisdictional coordination, how MPOs can start the ground steps or some of the infancy steps on working together, taking some of those approaches outside of the silo planning process and thinking more comprehensively about how to actually look at things from a cooperative standpoint. So another interesting thing, if you just Google megaregions or federal highway megaregions, it's not intended for you to see here, but there's a host of stuff that's out there. And my guess, this is probably more of a comment or open discussion for the principals that have been working on this much longer than me, is that this body of work is continuing to grow, especially from a national standpoint. So that's something that I hope that from the federal highway perspective and within USDOT, we've been actively contributing to as well. Some other factors that had USDOT interested in this is just a simple map that Catherine Ross and company helped us produce on just e-commerce and warehousing, as well as port locations and the volumes of tonnage overlaid with airports. And you can see here, these line up very nicely with the megaregional boundaries. You have the California megaregion, Cascadia, Arizona Sun Corridor, Texas Triangle, the Northeast, and the Midwest. This is another piece that we took out on the road show from our workshop series to really look at e-commerce and what necessarily it's doing positively, negatively, or indifferent, depending on how you want to spin it, to the transportation system and network with respect to freight truck traffic and on-time delivery and the expectation of I want something at my door right now. So how is that impact playing into things? Thinking about this from a land use perspective, distribution centers are popping up all up and down the East Coast and all throughout the United States. I can tell you some of the mega regional workshops that we've had. We actually have participants, I'll use the Lehigh Valley for an example. Their MPO staff not only attended the Mid-Atlantic workshop, but they attended the Northeast, and they also attended the Great Lakes mega region workshop. Simply because the impacts overlaid, they were one of the ground zero areas where the mega regional boundaries really included them within multiple areas. So that's something that we should think about as well. So our workshop series started in 2016. This is the same map you just saw, and it's intended to be a little messy because I wanted to show you exactly where these overlays occurred in terms of the 9 workshops that we delivered. We actually had one workshop that we produced with the state DOTs from California, New Mexico, Arizona, and Texas. We actually allowed those state DOT CEOs to come together. They started the first ever I-10 Corridor Coalition to focus on goods movement and productivity out of the ports of Long Beach and Los Angeles all the way through the Port of Houston. That's a down payment on the corridor. The I-10 corridor continues from LA all the way to Jacksonville, Florida. But the 4 most western states have actually signed an inaugural charter and have been working on operational and goods movement efficiency since 2016 on that particular topic. We had the Texas Triangle mega region, which Ming Zhang actually helped us coordinate and was an excellent partner on that. The Mid-South, Central Plains Heartland. We did a workshop in the Midwest for Greater Chicago. We split the Midwest in 2. I'll talk about that in just a minute. And we had a Great Lakes component that was done with Columbus. We worked with Catherine for the Piedmont Atlantic mega region. The Mid-Atlantic mega region was just done outside of Philadelphia. Bob was a part of that process. And then we actually had the Northeast mega region as well. The workshop series purpose, why did we do this? One of the things that we did internally within Federal Highway Administration before we launched the workshops A little bit about us. We're centralized with our headquarters office in DC, but we have division offices that complement state DOTs in all 50 states and in 2 U.S. territories. I said that to say we work very closely with the state DOTs and MPOs from that particular, with respect to transportation planning, et cetera. It was very critical that we had buy-in and a unique understanding with our division offices first. So that required us to work through our program offices, the Office of Infrastructure, Safety, Operations, Emergency Coordination. We spent about a year just internally talking with people about the concept of megaregions. Catherine actually came up one time. We had a webinar where we presented some policy findings and just some light global trends on what was happening and what this could particularly mean with respect to the federal aid program, which is the key component on how we deliver transportation funding to states and MPOs to deliver projects. So our workshop series, the first thing was we had to make sure that we were tailoring the message. So thinking about things from a network perspective in terms of the concept of megaregions, looking at how we could connect and collaborate across public sectors but outside of silos, address some common transportation and economic issues, and then identify some next steps for us to think about the implementation phase. So although each workshop was different, we really had a key framework that really comprised of 3 steps. Challenges spanning traditional planning backgrounds, so thinking about freight, goods movement, ITS, ports, airports, opportunities to enhance megaregional planning. The 4 C's of megaregions, I have to give credit to Barry Seymour. He is the executive director with the Delaware Valley Regional Planning Commission, which is the MPO for the greater Philadelphia area. That was our first workshop, and Barry coined that term, and we've been taking it and running with it. So most of you have heard about the 3C planning process. Just add commitment to that. So how exactly do we get commitment for people to take this beyond us convening a workshop for a day and a half and having a feel-good agenda and everything else? How do we really get people to really take this and really own it and move forward with it? And then we talked about next steps and opportunities and ongoing communication. When we tailored each of these workshops, we had to do a couple of things. The first, we provided detailed white papers that usually span between 8 and 15 pages that really looked at a number of factors. These are just some slides and some visuals in terms of this is exactly what truck traffic looked like on, I think this is Interstate 80 through the Midwest. This is from the Freight Analysis Framework data in US DOT. And this is what truck traffic volumes are expecting in 2045. So that provided a ground level understanding for people to come into each workshop and really understand why we're doing this, what are we thinking, or some common ground that we're kind of focusing on when we start talking about megaregions. So that way it takes away or at least deflates the balloon of myths and everything else, or urban assumptions, et cetera. Again, we also looked at MSA populations, port volumes, particular population for different states. One of the things that we've also done as a result of the 9 workshops, in trying to sell implementation to our leadership, we had to show, well, what's the value add? You've done all these workshops. They yielded about 100 people per workshop. We didn't pay for anyone. Everyone came on their own, and I think that's really important because when resources are constrained, folks found the time to step away from their day-to-day work and also make the trek to whatever city we held it and, get a hotel room, food, whatever. So from our leadership perspective, they were like, all right, why is this important? So we came up with an idea working with USDOT VOPI Center of just these nice and clean fact sheets in terms of this is what's happening in these areas. This is the population. This is the urban and the rural population. That's a huge topic right now in terms of the urban-rural divide. And then Bob's comment earlier in terms of, first-tier cities, but then also thinking about second- and third-tier cities. How do we really cater to them or really get folks to think about doing some care and feeding for those particular areas? So we've looked at megaregions not only from the big topic standpoint in terms of addressing freight, congestion, air quality, et cetera, but the I-10 Corridor Coalition was a little bit different because it really focused on a corridor approach. And that was an outgrowth from a pool fund study that USDOT funded on the operations and freight side. So that was a natural fit. And then this was just, we took some information and looked at freight data and identified some of the bottlenecks. So we didn't say, hey, if you go with megaregions, you could address these, but we tried to get people to think, this is where the system is getting bogged down. If we made some incremental improvements at these, what would the system then look like? And get people to start thinking about that. And then also some other information from our freight analysis framework on freight, et cetera. Some of the trends and feedback that we received from the workshop. This isn't all-inclusive. This is just a teaser. Congestion. Addressing congestion, especially in some of the more critical areas in terms of time delay, wasted fuel, etc. We have a requirement that each state should have freight plans, but those are not harmonized on a mega-regional level. They're just simply, do you have a state freight plan? Most of them are anywhere from 200 to 700 pages in volume, but it stops at the state boundaries. So how do we really get people to really think about harmonizing those plans, especially when it comes to addressing some of those critical key issues? Truck parking was something we did not plan for, but we heard it in almost every single workshop. Freight truck parking and overnight parking and reliability of the system and identification of issues, et cetera, in terms of notifications with weather delays, et cetera. Maintenance and state of good repair, that was a big discussion in the Northeast. And then data and funding, especially when it comes to data sharing and operations, and also how do we fund this and how do we pay for it. Some opportunities and challenges to grow. One of the key things that we heard that was really interesting is that a lot of folks are doing pieces of mega regional work, and some of them know it and some of them do not know it. A lot of folks are already coordinating on a mega regional scale, and you could see the aha kind of light bulb go off in most of the sessions. So most of our charge was, how do we incentivize or get people to really take that to the next level or continuing to move it? And again, this is just a quick list. I-95 Corridor Coalition, the Planning on the Edges Consortium. This is a consortium of MPOs along the I-95 corridor from DC all the way through New York City. I don't know how often that group meets, but it's been around for quite some time. And then the Northern California Bay Area Economic Council. Armando, I know you said they ran you guys out of San Francisco, but I think eventually the message did resonate because they did produce a really good plan across their MPO, across Northern California, to really think about mega regions and consultant looking at MPO connectivity. It's more from a pooled approach in terms of federal funding and how do they actually harmonize some of those requests with respect to Tiger, Infra, et cetera, but it's still done on a mega regional scale. This is just another visual in terms of harmonizing the message and looking at how exactly we look at assets and really get people to think about these are critical things that you have in your region that you should be thinking about when you're thinking mega regional in terms of highways, railroads, airports, waterborne assets, etc. And then same thing here. This is just an example from actually the Texas Triangle mega region in terms of airport volumes. I think most counties, if not all of them, have an airport in this country, and most people don't realize that, but they don't think about that as an asset. And most times how that plays into a mega regional conversation, but we also heard some of that in certain mega regions in terms of feedback and how to really leverage some of those particular conversations. This is just a quick summary by each of the workshops that we conducted in terms of where we held the workshop, what were some of the planned actions, and some of the anticipated outcomes. Harmonizing the state freight plans were almost unanimous across the 9 mega regional workshops that we held. We heard a lot of discussion on planning for the impacts of emerging technologies such as connected vehicles and autonomous vehicles. We could probably spend 3 days talking about that in itself, so I took a lot of that out of this conversation because I know that can take on a life of its own. But then also we heard some really cool things, such as in the Piedmont area, utilizing scenario planning on a mega regional scale and really thinking about and envisioning what things could look like or what the future would look like from a mega regional standpoint. And then even in the Midwest, the conversation was more so about money. Chicago, we talked a lot about CREATE and the convergence of all the major railroads within that particular area and what CREATE is doing to sort of break through some of those bottlenecks. but really how to really get that going and how to keep or sustain that particular momentum beyond just necessarily that particular federal investment or effort. And then for the final series of workshops, just thinking about how people are communicating on a day-to-day basis with respect to their MPO plans or their state plans. That was just one of the things that a lot of folks were like, yep, we know our neighbors, we know who the adjourning MPO is, but we may talk to them once a year at the annual state conference or when we run into them in another venue, but there's not really a strategic discussion that's happening. So how do we really incentivize that from a grassroots standpoint? Just some really quick observations and next steps. Tailored messaging was key for all of the 9 workshops. One size did not fit all. And we were dead in the water if we used the same white paper. Obviously we couldn't. We had to tailor each white paper, which took time, working with consultants and pulling data and thinking about how exactly we need to message this, etc. Politics is another thing. As a Fed, I have to walk that fine line. We're here to serve the public, but making sure that people understand that this is not a partisan thing. Transportation should be one of the easiest things to talk about because it's not red and it's not blue and it's not independent. It's something we all depend on and rely on and we need to move the system forward. So how do we really get beyond that? So that's been one key issue. Myths and assumptions. It's been very hard. People were thinking, okay, megaregions means that you're going to take me as a small MPO and you're going to just absorb me, or you're going to be making decisions about, as Bob used earlier this morning, why should you be making decisions about a stop sign in my community if you're 200 miles away? And that's not the case. So dispelling that. Also looking at international trends in trade. If you look at one of the earlier maps that I had, we actually had the areas in Mexico and Canada with their populations noted there. And it's been really difficult to get people to kind of peek over those fences, if you will. I didn't use walls, but really to peek over there and just kind of say, these areas are growing across these boundaries if we want them to or not, so what are we going to do about it? Engaging the private sector was another critical issue, or has been a critical issue. And that's happening well in certain areas throughout the country, but in others not as well. And then finally, we launched, because we couldn't use megaregions at the time, the term, an implementation pilot program on national economic partnerships in May of 2018. And we put something together and just said, hey, let's just see who's going to bite at it, where we would put out implementation grants for about $250,000 to state DOTs and MPOs. We know that's just a drop in the bucket, but the whole point was to say, give us a letter of interest in terms of who you would want to work with on a mega regional scale and what issue would you resolve in 18 months or less. And from those 26 letters of interest that we received, we got 12 really good applications that we invited to actually give us a full proposal and more detailed information with the detailed budget. We reviewed those. Those are under review now. I am hoping and pushing, so if you see me looking at my phone, it's because I'm multitasking and trying to get that done as well. We should be able to have those award nominations out, and hopefully that would be the beginning of something US DOT and Federal Highway has never done, which is incentivizing this work to be done. One last note that I did not put on the slide, that's a big challenge, is harmonizing this across modes. So I'm just within Federal Highway, which is one US DOT mode. There's Federal Transit, and they've been at the table on certain conversations. Federal Railroad was with us on, and I know we're going to hear about some of those issues in just a moment. On the Northeast Corridor, there's a lot of interest in terms of the NEC Futures program, but there's a lot of other modes that have not even come to the table yet. So there's a wide open field. Thank you.
I'll give it a little bit slightly different twist on the transportation issue, focusing on rail, and I've had quite a bit of experience over the last decade, maybe a little bit more, on intercity rail projects, some in the high-speed category, some that sort of expand and cross that definition, but really focused on serving mega regions, that scale of geography. I'll assume, I won't go to the point of, all right, why is rail an appropriate modal choice for serving megaregions, and say that there's been pretty good research and analysis to say there is a sweet spot for high-speed, high-performance ground transportation at the scale of the megaregion. I'll run through a short list of where we are in the U.S. in developing these things, and if you just pay attention to the media, it's pretty easy to be depressed and pessimistic. But I'm going to try to spin that into we have a great opportunity to learn from our current experience and figure out how to actually make things work in the future. Then I want to talk a little bit about what's the nature of really what I call high performance rail, and the notion of high-speed rail, I think, is in many ways a red herring, because speed is probably the least important characteristic of these high-performance rail systems. And I want to end up with some thoughts about governance and funding, and how do we actually get to saying yes on these projects and getting things implemented. So again, this is summary of the characteristics of really what makes rail an appropriate mode for megaregion scale geography. And there's a lot of research that says, data that say that in the 100 to 500 mile distance between places, rail, particularly rail that is reliable, high capacity, offers good travel times, can be competitive with both highway and air. In the 200 to 300 mile zone, really is kind of the sweet spot for rail as you improve the characteristics of the service. Really, you can capture a significant share of travel over that broad range. Probably the most important feature of investment in better rail in established parts of the country where there is already rail service is the capacity that building new and expanding the performance offers. Part of that is the ability to deliver high service frequency, so very convenient travel for the user, regular service intervals, predictable trip times. Again, regular service improves the opportunities for performance of a network as opposed to single corridors and lines. And we've got some data now that are saying that the performance of high performance networks work a lot better than individual corridors and projects. But much of our work to date has not really focused at the network scale. Connectivity between rail services and between rail and connecting modes is again critical to that network performance. And finally, speed, and performance does matter, but what the solution is for speed and in part technology, really it needs to come behind those other service characteristics. And so we're finding that the answer isn't automatically go as fast as you can. It's how fast do you need to go in order to capture a significant share of the market in rail, again, assuming that's good when we can do it, and also being able to deliver all the other benefits. And so one of the questions we're getting now is, all right, why are we relying on this 19th century technology of steel wheels on steel rail? As opposed to maglev, as opposed to hyperloop, and assuming that these new technologies can be proven and actually can deliver higher top speed, that question really should be around, all right, how do we analyze those as part of a network? And they may have a role, but particularly in the established parts of the U.S. where there is a legacy rail network, our analysis on several projects is showing that incrementally improving the performance of the existing railway network, can deliver all these other capacity, frequency, network connectivity benefits in a way that actually is easier and probably cheaper in the long run than trying to leapfrog to the brand new technology. That's not saying that there isn't a role for that, but the path to that is through a comprehensive network megaregion scale alternatives analysis, as opposed to let's just focus on a mode, let's just focus on a corridor or a project. based on where we are today, there's been a lot of consideration of rail corridors really in most of the mega regions in that America 2050 map. And so that thinking about mega regions, did trigger some federal money and a federal program that was initiated in 2008, right before the economic downturn, that generated some money that's been put into planning of high-speed corridors. All of the work in the Northeast kind of emanated from that federal process, and actually work that the University of Pennsylvania sort of kick-started in 2010, that then was picked up by Amtrak and the feds. California has been out in front doing its own thing. But, if you were to look at the landscape today, we've built nothing. I guess we have some shovels in the ground in the Central Valley in California. We've got some private actors, in Florida, Las Vegas, Texas, that are developing ideas of privately led initiatives, but not much public money. After the initial tranche in 2008, that money was sort of associated with the economic downturn stimulus and throwing money at these problems really before we were ready to see stimulus benefits kind of put a negative connotation on the whole program. That, coupled with politics, in the last administration carried on to this one, has resulted basically in no federally led program. None of the states, have the resources really to make this happen on their own. So there are some bright spots. The planning that's being done in Canada, kind of based on what's being done in Europe and the UK, built on more comprehensive business case analyses than we've been able to apply, are showing signs of progress. I'm involved in a study right now, the latest in a series in the Pacific Northwest or Cascadia corridor, that is a joint project of the state of Washington, state of Oregon, province of British Columbia, with significant money in the study from Microsoft, as the principal interested party in Seattle, responding to growth, congestion, how are we going to move people around in the future? And so that's an interesting opportunity. That study actually, rather than being transportation focused, is what's the business case? What's the investment case for investing in a major new transportation corridor? So there's some promise, I think, in that line of thinking, that we haven't really applied to things that we've analyzed from a purely transportation standpoint. Why haven't we been able to make a go decision on high performance rail? Principally comes down to the money question, I think, lack of funding. Why is there a lack of funding? Well, there's lack of an impetus to provide that funding, I think, and that really drives from a business case. And our traditional way of measuring benefits through ridership, which is at best today in our process, taking historical data, projecting into the future, applying demographic growth forecasts, and estimating your mode split on the transportation project that you're looking at, doesn't generate enough ridership benefits and sort of tag-along economic benefits to justify the investment. Particularly with the fact that we're basing our capital cost estimates on our recent history of building big projects. And in the case of rail, those are all tremendously expensive, even to the point of being 4 times more the unit cost for equivalent work as are being spent in places like Germany, where it's not really the cost of labor, it's not the benefits. There are lots of reasons why our recent costs are high. The combination then of very high costs, relatively low benefits, and also the failure to expand our thinking, to the mega region question of what do we want this investment for? We're not really solely looking at reacting to growth trends in the past. We're really trying to anticipate what kind of infrastructure is going to help transform economies and conditions for people, residential and employment location decisions within the mega region geography in the future. And that needs different data, that needs different methodology than we traditionally apply to project-focused, federally funded transportation projects, which are very conservative in their approach and work at the small local scale in terms of figuring out how to spread relatively scarce federal money around lots of places, in relatively small amounts. But the big kind of programmatic investments that we're talking about don't emerge out of the back of that analysis with a successful business case. That said, there are models, the way they do it in the UK, the way they're doing it now in Canada, the way we're looking to start doing it in Pacific Northwest, that start to develop the case largely based on the strategic assessment of where we want to be. We've got to figure out a way to get our cost of construction of big infrastructure down. And there is now research that is diving into why is our cost structure so high. A lot of that has to do, it's a combination of things. It's not one answer. It's not so much that we don't know how to build things, but we have not been paying attention to productivity and efficiency of labor and workforces. A lot of that just is in process and the cost of money over time, and the fact that what gets attributed to cost overruns in places like California is really the fact that we've been at this now for multiple decades and costs go up, and so the original budgets that you agree on 20 years later, of course, are not going to be the same dollar amounts, and so that's not to say there isn't something in the engineering to be fixed, but it's multiple things. That history of perceived and actual cost overruns really has damaged our credibility as an industry on, we can deliver things on time, on budget, in a predictable way, in a way that delivers benefits. And even though, if we had a business case to say that the level of investment we're making delivers benefits, and that's probably a good story, because we don't make the business case. The media reports are, costs go up, these guys don't know what they're doing, let's just jettison the whole thing. And so the recent decision in California to reduce the scope of that project to what is affordable and manageable in a small part of the territory, is reacting to that credibility gap and responding to the lack of what normally would have been expected in terms of federal funding contribution, which isn't there today, and recognizing reality. That said, they're completing the environmental work. The vision is still there. What you don't read about in the paper is the benefits are still considered important to the state to be able to move people by rail, as opposed to having to invest in the aviation system or endure the increased congestion of increased highway use. Another credibility issue is California in particular, and I think elsewhere. We're seeing some of this in New York. It's become politically expedient to promise that we can deliver big infrastructure with no impact, which just isn't realistic, particularly with high-performance rail. We need to be relatively straight to go fast. We don't have as much discretion as in the highway business to work around constraints. This is stuff that has potentially tremendous transformational benefits, hugely expensive, big impacts, but also big environmental benefits. So if you look again at the megaregion scale, it's a good story. If you zoom down locally, you can't do this without taking property, without displacing businesses, without some impacts. But we've trained ourselves now in the US in transportation infrastructure to say we can continue to move ahead and everybody's going to be okay. And that's a false promise. And so one of the problems in California has been getting down to the nitty-gritty. All of a sudden people are saying, well, you told us we wouldn't be affected, now we are, we're against this thing. And lastly, we don't have a decision-making process that conforms to the scale of megaregions, or really conforms to the programmatic, systematic level of investment we're talking about. I want to end up with some thoughts about that. A couple of aspects of how we've come to think of high-performance rail and why it's more than just high-speed rail. One of the key things we're seeing in our analyses of travel markets is responsiveness to the ability to deliver more and different types of rail service. And what you focus on in the high-speed world is, this top end, to get the really fast train, which is good for business travelers, good for folks on expense account, premium fare, what delivers some profit back to the operator. And that's important to a mega region to be able to enable that kind of travel to happen more efficiently. But what we're finding is, the real benefit for transport, and I think the ability to uplift economically places within the scale of a mega region really is in the lower end. And this is largely driven by work we've done for the Northeast Corridor, again, where we have a lot of rail today supporting the higher speed, higher performance system. We've got lots of room to greatly improve operations and travel below that. We are, and some of that exists at the mega region scale, some of that drives down to improvements in the metropolitan area. And as an example, we in the Northeast Corridor defined a type of rail service that kind of sits between Amtrak today and commuter rail today. And we dubbed it Metropolitan Service. And when we explained it to people, they liked it. When we explained it to Amtrak in the States, they felt threatened because it was something new and different and not their thing. So that was an interesting reaction. But we found that if we could take where Amtrak runs today in the Northeast, actually find the additional locations where they don't stop, that are locations of economic activity, transportation connectivity, places that can benefit from improved access. But we run that with better performing equipment on better rail infrastructure. We can deliver those trains in less time. We can run them every 15 minutes at the peak. So it really becomes a transit service that's running at the scale of the mega region. It's priced somewhat above what you pay for the commuter train, but a lot below what you pay for the Amtrak train. So it's an affordable ticket. And at the end of the day, our analysis showed we can fill up those trains enough at a very reasonable fare to cover the operating costs of that system. So the premium service, the new Acela Express, makes a lot of money that can be contributed back to the network. This core service really provides tremendous capacity for movement. Again, sort of taking the notion of a city, expanding it to a mega region, and providing a transit service in the mega region. That's really what we're looking to do. And this is a zoom into that concept applied then to the New York region with our spine, but then other connections where we offer that equivalent level of service. So as a network, we're providing this great connectivity, something that looks like the New York subway map, but this is now really at the mega region scale. It goes to Philadelphia, New Haven, Long Island, Albany, but tying those places together much more productively. Staying with the network theme, analysis we did as part of Federal Railroad Administration looking at mega region rail corridors in a planning process. We looked at the Midwest network, and the new work we did was focus on networks as opposed to single corridor, single projects, which is really what the states and Amtrak and the FRA had been looking at previously. And we found some huge benefits to developing this as an integrated coordinated network. And this is looking at data, just intercity travel data, but what the rail share, basically rail's ability to capture from highway and air. And we found that looking at the whole network centered on Chicago generated a 70% increase in ridership and a 50% increase in revenue that allowed this network to cover its operating costs. Where individual corridors, if we would tackle this individually, you can make a case for St. Louis and Detroit and Minneapolis, St. Paul as standalone intercity rail corridors, but all the other connections don't pan out as an individual corridor, but as part of the network they do. And then the amount of travel by rail starts to mean something in terms of the connectivity among these places. So whatever your benefits of the mega region are, you get that with that network. Here's a map of the idea that Bob and his Penn class are looked at a couple of years ago and are revisiting this year, of the equivalent sort of expanded rail network in New England. The existing Amtrak corridor is the one that follows the coast up through Providence. There's a spur line up to Hartford and Springfield. a little bit of other rail activity, but not much. But the notion of developing that into a network with frequent service on all these legs, is in our thesis what is going to tie the smaller cities together, and also to New York and Boston in a way that enables economic transformation that wouldn't be possible with those places isolated on their own. And we figured out how to make that fit on the railroad. The last thought on service is connectivity is critical. It's not just rail, it's not just individual corridors. So intercity and regional metropolitan networks working together, where the stations are, how you develop around them, how the region is able to access rail is important. And the first and last mile. Traditionally, intercity rail is drive and park or be dropped off, picked up at the station. Transit connectivity, kind of shared usage, the whole new mobility environment with potential autonomous connected vehicles, increasing the shared access in addition to bikes and personal mobility has the potential to be able to get to the rail network in a way that you can't today. And so again, this is part of the future equation of how we can deliver dramatically more use of the system. And it's not increasing parking lots. It's really, but the opportunities I think are tremendous. Framework for decision making. Again, I assert, based on again experience of trying to push these rail projects, is that at the highest level of decision making, we have a mismatch of both geography and mission. Geography, we don't have units of government that capture the area of benefit of making these investments. And part of this you see in the maps that we saw earlier. If you could draw benefit boundaries around the benefit districts, you could make better decisions. Today, the federal government and the states, don't really adequately cover megaregion geography. We also don't have organizations or entities with the mission to look out for the future economy and social conditions within the megaregion geography. The missions of Amtrak, of the state DOTs, of the railroads, of the federal government are aligned differently. So what do we need to be able to get to a good decision? We need to create an entity that can sponsor transportation service, and I'd say this probably is more than just, should be more than just rail transportation, within the area of benefit of a megaregion. It needs to be accountable to our elected government at the federal and state level, but it needs some authority on its own to be able to make good decisions. We need to think about this as a long-term program, not a series of individual projects. The federal role is important. If we can demonstrate a business case to the federal government, which is I think there, then there's an important role for the feds. If not, I'd suggest we need to be able to convince the federal government to devolve sufficient responsibility to this entity that can be a collaboration of states. I don't really have a recommendation as to what the governance structure is, but I'm pretty sure it needs to be different than what we've got. And at the end of the day, we need political leadership. So we can have a good governance structure, but we also need to find the individuals at multiple levels of government to push this. Done some thinking about how to organize that decision-making process. We spend a lot of time talking about delivery and asset ownership and operations, and those are important, but none of this happens or works unless we have an entity or an ability to look at the total system and sponsor it. And again, this could be an organization structure focused on rail. I think it's better as an organization structure for transportation, at least passenger, but probably passenger and freight. What does this sponsor entity need to do? It's responsible for the whole thing. It needs to be able to set goals, do analysis, basically do planning work, figure out what its vision is. It needs to then be able to make decisions. Based on those decisions, it needs to be able to make a financial funding commitment. Right? And that's the piece that's missing in any of the sort of structures like the Northeast Corridor Commission that have been set up today. And again, it needs to be accountable upwards to elected government. So in quick summary, again, we've asserted that high-performance rail is an appropriate backbone for mega-region scale transportation. What do we need to do? We need to figure out how to make a better business case that's better modeling of future scenarios, and how do we model the economic effects and the residential and business location decisions, that are part of the mega-region concept. We don't measure them well today. We need to move in the direction of creating the institutional framework, and we need to develop dedicated long-term sources of funding to be able to implement a program over an extended time period. And the sources of money for that, a big part of it should come from user fees. We have the gas tax today that basically goes for highway maintenance, but it hasn't been updated and doesn't cover it. That notion, though, of user fees is a good one. Some combination of tolling, vehicle miles traveled, charging, air and rail ticket surcharges, again, spread across broad travelers at a mega-region scale, I think makes sense. Federal and state funds, to the extent there is a benefit to the federal government and the states in that business case, it's appropriate for capital funding to come from there. And then value capture, which can fund a part of this. There's been a lot of thought of, can we rely solely on that? Generally, as we've looked at it, there isn't enough money there in the right time frame to be able to fully pay for at least high-performance rail investment, but it's an important part of the picture. And then taken together, there is money there to spend, what in the Northeast would be a couple of $100 billion over 20 to 30 years. I suggest that that's not the way to think of it. It's, we spend maybe $1 billion a year on rail in the Northeast. We need to bump that up in the near term to 4 or 5 to get started in this investment program. We need to then bump it up to maybe 8 to 10 a year to be able to deliver the whole Northeast network in 25 years or so. And that's doable, that's consistent with what the, a reasonable share of the regional economy would be to spend on infrastructure. And I think that's pretty much what I had. So, thanks.